Fritz got his undergraduate education at MIT and PhD at Stanford in 1969, the PhD in 69, both of those in chemical physics. And he decided during that process that his main contribution in science was going to be in theoretical chemistry, and he's focused on that area. He spent almost 20 years at Berkeley, immediately following his degree at Stanford, and in 1987, or for the last 10 years, he's been Graham-Purdue Professor of Chemistry and the Director of the Computational Center at University of Georgia. He's been recognized as I guess, to use a funny turn of phrase, as one of the most recognizable chemists in the world, one of the most highly cited from his publications, which number over 700 in scientific journals. He was awarded early on in his career 2 of the nicest prizes, in my view, from the American Chemical Society, the award in pure chemistry, which is given to a person younger than 35 or 6, I can't remember the exact age, that shows the most promise and done the most exciting work at a young age, and the Bakelin Award, which is also a young chemist's award sponsored by the ACS. Fritz, I first met him on a personal level, right near the beginning of his career, actually, at a seminar at Berkeley in I think it was 1972 or 3. He'd only been there a few years, and I met him at that time, and I didn't realize he was a Christian at that time. I'm not sure I realized I was a Christian at that time. But both of us, I think, went through transformations in our life during our first few years at the State University experience that we were experiencing, and Fritz gets an opportunity to tell you about some of his. I presume he'll personalize some of what he's going to tell you about, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So without further ado, or taking more of his time, I'd like to introduce my colleague and friend, Fritz Schaefer.
Thank you, Mike. Am I electrified here? Without this? Good, good. I've been asked to say there are about 6 or 7 empty seats down at the front here. Tempted to make some comments about my friend Mike Bowers, but I'll save those for the chemistry audience. Mike, you're not off. Just so you'll know, you're not off the hook. I have plenty I'm going to say about you, but I'll save it till later. It was exciting arriving here last night on a little plane. I never knew it was so long to get from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara. It seemed like it was about a 7-hour flight last night. My knuckles were pure white by the time we finally landed. But it's obviously a wonderful day here, and I'm delighted to be here. My topic this afternoon is making sense of faith and science. I give a number of general lectures in this area, and I've tried to take materials from several of them that would fit the title that I have been assigned, and I'll leave it to you to decide just how well we've done. I want to begin our discussion making sense of faith and science. I want to begin this from a fairly broad perspective. I think the place to begin is that it's commonly stated that science and Christianity are incompatible. I remember teaching freshman chemistry at Berkeley, and in a manner I don't have time to describe, this was 1983, I think, it just slipped out that I was a Christian, and a very eager and bright young student came up to me after my lecture and said, the person in my life that I have most admired was my high school chemistry teacher last year, and he told me that it was impossible to be a scientist and a Christian. So there obviously are people, and I still meet people here and there that tell me that science has disproved God and other things of that sort. So this is the general question we want to begin with this afternoon. But I do want to approach this as broadly as possible at the beginning. And to do that, I want to note that there have been some altercations between science and virtually every other intellectual area. For example, literature, which might strike you as for me to say that people thought there was a great conflict between science and literature might surprise some of you, but in fact, such a conflict has existed. And as my source, I would use this recent textbook by Gallagher and London of exactly that title. And let me quote from them. They state that in recent history, literature has often found itself in opposition to science. So to understand modern views about literature, we must recognize the dominance of science in our culture. For several centuries, the sciences have set the standards of truth for Western culture, and their undeniable usefulness in helping us to organize, analyze, and manipulate facts has given them an unprecedented importance in modern society. And I don't want to use too much of our time on this, but I want to show you that this is a serious concern. And I'll just use one example from the English Romantic poet John Keats from his poem Lamia, in which he expresses exactly these ideas of a terrible conflict between science and literature. Keats feared that a world in which myths and poetic visions had vanished would become a barren and uninviting place. Now, in this poem, I'm going to slightly destroy the tenor of the poem, because every time Keats uses the word philosophy, I'm going to replace it with science, because that's what he means. This is what he means. So those of you who are poets, I apologize, but we're taking substance over aesthetics here. So Keats, in his poem Lamia, do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold science. There was an awful rainbow once in heaven. We knew her woof, her texture. She is given in the dull catalog of common things. Science will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air, and gnomed mind unweave a rainbow. So there has been a conflict between science and literature, and I really would describe this as the new kid on the block syndrome. Science is a relatively new activity. We'll be talking about the origins of modern science this afternoon, and when it came in and challenged other areas, there was resistance. Now, a popular statement of the problem we're dealing with this afternoon was given by C.S. Lewis some number of years ago, talking about the fact that it took him till he was 33 years of age to become a Christian. And this is in the book, which is a good one, Surprised by Joy. It's the autobiography of his early life. And Lewis is there explaining why he was an atheist for so long. He says, "You will understand that my atheism was inevitably based on what I believed to be the findings of the sciences. And those findings, not being a scientist, I had to take on trust, in fact, on authority." So someone told him that it was not possible to be a scientist and a Christian, perhaps like this high school chemistry teacher that made this statement to one of my Berkeley freshmen. And Lewis says since he didn't know anything about science, he just assumed that what was said was true. Before we get too far into this, let me just give a couple of examples of alternatives to a belief in the sovereign God of the universe. The first one I will take Lev Landau. Those of you who are my age will certainly be familiar, and who are in the physical sciences will certainly be familiar with the famous series of textbooks by Landau and Lifshitz, used universally, even to this day. And of course, Landau was a distinguished research scientist as well as being the author of famous textbooks, probably the most brilliant Soviet physicist of the 20th century. This is a conversation reported in Physics Today, the Time magazine, as it were, of the physics community. It's from an article by his close friend Kolotnikov. Kolotnikov says, the last time I saw Landau was in 1968 after he'd had an operation. His health had greatly deteriorated. Lifshitz and I were summoned by the hospital. We were informed that there was practically no chance that he could be saved. When I entered his ward, Landau was lying on his side, his face turned to the wall. He heard my steps, turned his head and said, "Kolot, please save me." These were the last words I heard from Landau. He died that night. Just one other example along these lines. These things can be a bit depressing, so we don't want to do too much of this. Famous Indian-born American scientist Chandrasekhar, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1983 for his work on cosmology, faculty member at the University of Chicago for virtually his entire scientific career. And this is from a biography of Chandrasekhar by his good friend Wally. And in some ways, this is the most interesting part of the biography. It's an appendix, and it's an interview between the author and his subject. And Chandrasekhar begins. He says, in fact, I consider myself an atheist, but I have a feeling of disappointment because the hope for contentment and a peaceful outlook on life as a result of pursuing a goal has remained unfulfilled. His biographer is pretty surprised to hear him say that. He says, "What? I don't understand. You mean single-minded pursuit of science, understanding parts of nature and comprehending nature with such enormous success still leaves you with a feeling of discontentment." And Chandrasekhar says, "I don't really have a sense of fulfillment. All I have done seems to not be very much." At this point, the biographer is trying to lighten this conversation for obvious reasons. He says, "Don't you think everybody has the same problem?" And Chandrasekhar is not going to, he's not going to concede. He said, "Well, that might be. But the fact that other people experience this problem doesn't change the fact that one is experiencing it. It doesn't become less personal on that account." And then his final statement, "What is true from my own experience is that I simply don't have that sense of harmony which I had hoped for when I was young, and I have persevered in science for over 50 years. The time I have devoted to other things is minuscule." A fairly balanced statement on the relationship between science and the rest of the universe is provided by Erwin Schrödinger. Schrödinger, some of you would know, the author of the most important equation in science, an equation I'll be talking about a good bit this afternoon, Mike, at 4 o'clock. We expect all of them to be there? 3:45. Cookies. Yes, absolutely. You don't want to miss this chemistry lecture. Schrödinger, obviously one of the great scientists of this century by any objective standard, says, "I'm very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient." Gives a lot of factual information, puts all our experience in a magnificently consistent order, but it is ghastly silent about all that is really important to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. Science sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we're not inclined to take them seriously. One does occasionally find a bit of humor on this topic, relationship between science and God. And here's a story I found a few years ago from Chemistry in Britain, a popular magazine that is popular to chemists who live in Britain and to their friends who live elsewhere. This has a very wide circulation throughout the world. This story was made up for the introduction of a book on science policy. Now, science policy is clearly one of the most boring topics in the universe. I think we would all agree on that. And so to get a book launched on this topic obviously requires a certain amount of creativity, and you'll see this here. So they asked the question, if God applied to the British Science Funding Agency for a research grant to develop a heaven and an earth, he would be turned down nowadays on the following grants. And those of you who apply for grants will really appreciate this, believe me, because I haven't had all these comments on one of my grant proposals, and I'm not claiming to be God. I hope all understand that as well. But I have had some of these very same comments on my research proposal. So God has proposed to create a heaven and an earth, and he's rejected because his project is too ambitious. We've all heard that one, those of us who put in scientific grants. He has no previous track record. Well, obviously, no universe, no track record. His only publication is a book, not a paper in a refereed journal. He refuses to collaborate with his biggest competitor. And his proposal for a new heaven and earth is all up in the air. So we do see some enjoyable things. I want to begin from pretty neutral ground, so let me start with two people who have no theistic bent whatever. The first, C.P. Snow. Some of you would be familiar with C.P. Snow because he wrote a famous lengthy essay called The Two Cultures in the Scientific Revolution. C.P. Snow was a physical chemist at Oxford University. He was a pretty good physical chemist, but not too good. I mean, he had to be pretty good or he wouldn't have been at Oxford, but he wasn't one of the greats at Oxford. He never made it to be professor, for example. To be professor in the Oxford system, you, until recently, had to be very good. Now anybody can be a professor at Oxford. All you have to do is get appointed. You'll eventually become professor, just like here in the U.S. Yeah, just like in the U.S. But in the old days, being a professor at Oxford was a big deal. C.P. Snow never made it. He was a good spectroscopist. But halfway through his career, I think he realized that he wasn't going to get to the very apex of the scientific enterprise, and he began writing novels. Now, these were not trashy novels. Let me be clear about that. They're actually quite good novels. They still read well. The one I would recommend the most is called The Masters. Sounds like it's science fiction, but it's not. It's a book about college life at Oxford and Cambridge and the politics that go on there. It's quite an interesting book. And he made much more money and became much more famous as a writer of these novels than he ever had as a physical chemist. And towards the end of his career, he decided to try to integrate his life. And so he wrote this book, The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution. The two cultures, one chemistry, of which he worked on a good bit, and the other part the humanities, literature, and so on. And his statement there on this general topic is that slightly more scientists are in religious terms unbelievers compared with the rest of the intellectual world, though there are plenty who are religious, and that seems to be increasingly so among the young. Another statement, again by a person with no theistic inclinations, Richard Feynman. Many of you would be familiar with him as probably the most humorous scientist of this century, as well as one of the best. In this essay he wrote 9 years before he received the Nobel Prize in physics, he said this: many scientists do believe in both science and God, the God of revelation, in a perfectly consistent way. So the facts of the matter are that anyone who has taken the time to familiarize himself or herself with the scientific enterprises knows indeed that many scientists are Christians. Alan Lightman, MIT professor, took the Dan Rather approach to investigative reporter approach to. I don't think he's as aggressive as some of these investigative reporters we're seeing on the in the news these days, but less aggressive than that. Took his tape recorder and traveled around the world and talked to famous cosmologists about what they thought about the origin of the universe and other ultimate questions. And this is his summary statement in his book that Harvard Press published a few years back. He says that references to God continued in the scientific literature until the middle to late 1800s. It seems likely that the lack of religious references after this time resulted more from a change in social and professional convention among scientists rather than from any change in underlying thought. Indeed, contrary to popular myth, scientists appear to have the same range of attitudes about religious matters as does the general public. Now, you could say, well, his studies are just a bunch of anecdotes. We don't like anecdotal evidence. For those of you that don't like anecdotal evidence, here's a poll. Okay, here's a poll, just like the kind we read about in the newspaper every morning. This is published in Chemical and Engineering News, another marvelous, popular magazine that I'm sure many of you have read many articles in over the years. It's put out by the American Chemical Society. They report, Sigma Xi is a national honor society, and they sent out a lot of inquiries and got back 3,300 responses, which statistically is a huge number. You only need about 500 to determine whether the president's going to be in office next week or not. So this is a huge statistical response. And what they find is, it may surprise some. It may surprise some. I don't think you can read this. I can barely read it myself. But the last paragraph says that scientists are anchored in the U.S. mainstream. Half participate in religious activities regularly, and so on. If you look at the poll in more detail, it says something like, on a given Sunday morning, 43% of all PhD scientists are in church, and plus or minus 1%, the same percentage of the general population is in church. So it would appear, both from anecdotal evidence and from statistical studies, that whatever people think about God doesn't seem to be very much related to whether that person has a PhD in the sciences or not. I want to talk a little bit about Michael Polanyi. Michael Polanyi, another one of these interesting people of the middle part of this century, a very distinguished physical chemist, a much better physical chemist than C.P. Snow, I might add, but he also seemed to tire of his interest in science about halfway through his career and became a philosopher, and actually became more famous as a philosopher than as a scientist. This is what he has to say in his one of his books called Personal Knowledge, which I would recommend. And Polanyi's writings have struck a resonant chord with many scientists, or certainly with most of the scientists who have read them. And he says in Personal Knowledge, I shall re-examine here the suppositions underlying our belief in science. That's interesting in itself, talking about a belief in science. And propose to show that they are more extensive than is usually thought. They will appear to coextend with the entire spiritual foundations of man and go to the very root of his social existence. Hence, I will urge our belief in science should be regarded as a token of much wider convictions. Michael Polanyi was born in Budapest of a Jewish family, and it's interesting that about the same time he reinvented himself as a philosopher instead of a chemist, he also joined the Roman Catholic Church. My comment on really on the whole book, Personal Knowledge, is this, that Polanyi is pointing out that the observer is always there in the laboratory, nowadays at the computer as well, and always makes conclusions and is never neutral. Every scientist brings presuppositions to his or her work. The scientist never questions the basic soundness of the scientific method. This faith of the scientist arose historically from the Christian belief that God the Father created a perfectly orderly universe. Now, the only overhead I show during this talk that really gets people mad is this one. If you're squeamish, just close your eyes and shut your ears, and this will pass. This will pass. These are not my own words, and it's so controversial. I will even tone it down a little bit when I read it to you. It's by a British academic, Robert Clark, in his book Christian Belief and Science. He says, however we may interpret the fact, scientific development, and I would replace this with the phrase sustained scientific development, has occurred only in a Christian culture. The ancients had brains as good as ours in all civilizations, ancient Babylonia, Egypt, Greece, India, Rome, Persia, China, and so on. Science developed to a certain point and then stopped. It is easy to argue speculatively that perhaps science might have been able to develop in the absence of Christianity, but in fact it never did, and it just gets more controversial after that. So that's a good place to stop that statement. But it's certainly a sobering one for anyone who has grown up with the idea that science has disproved God. I think just about everyone agrees with this. So I've gone from a statement that from somebody else that's quite controversial to one of my own that I think virtually everyone agrees with and is foundational to the beginnings of modern science. The emergence of modern science was associated with a repudiation of the rationalism of Greek philosophers who pronounced on how the world should behave with insufficient attention to finding out how the world in fact did behave. I think this really marks the beginning. Now, who were these people there at the beginning? Well, certainly one was Francis Bacon. When I was a kid, I was told that Francis Bacon discovered the scientific method. Well, the higher critics have gotten into the philosophy of science as well, and now they tell us that he just stole it from somebody else and popularized it. Well, that's fine. In any case, he brought it to the public attention. Now, here is a pretty famous statement by Francis Bacon. Many physicists and chemists would have heard this statement, but it's worth repeating. This is the famous 2 books statement of Francis Bacon. He says, "Let no one think or maintain that a person can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's Word or in the book of God's works." So this is the 2 book statement. Francis Bacon is talking about the book of God's Word, the Bible, Old and New Testaments, the book of God's works, nature or the creation. And Bacon is saying you can't learn too much about either of these. You should learn as much as you can about them both. And I've been pretty serious about this. The reason Professor Bowers didn't know I was a Christian in 1972 is because I wasn't. So your observations were correct. But I became a Christian the next year, and I've been working on both of these books. I've actually read the Bible 17 times, so I ought to be getting it by now. Johannes Kepler, I think many of you would know as the person who provided a drastic improvement in our understanding of the solar system by postulating that planets move in elliptical orbits rather than circular orbits. A devout Lutheran, when asked why he did science, that's a very important question. We should ask all of our students why they're doing everything they're doing. When asked why he did science, Kepler responded that he desired in his scientific research to obtain a sample test of the delight of the divine creator in his work and to partake of his joy. People have expressed this in various ways down through the years, to think God's thoughts after him, to know the mind of God, a variety of things. You might think that Kepler was a deist from a statement like this. It's possible that if that's all you knew about him, you could draw that conclusion. But I would encourage you to read more about his life. A typical statement by Johannes Kepler is this one: "I believe only and alone in the service of Jesus Christ. In him is all refuge and solace." Now, my number 2 favorite of all of these founders of modern science is certainly Blaise Pascal. You know, we in freshman chemistry we are constrained to use these silly units called SI units. Now, maybe that some of you are not into freshman chemistry, but you know, when you teach freshman chemistry, you have to be very well behaved, and I've been doing this for a long time now, so I use these SI units, but some of them are really quite silly. And one of the silly ones is the Pascal. A Pascal is the SI unit for pressure. It's hardly a poof. I mean, it's just such a small unit of pressure that it's not very useful. Now, I don't say this in any way to denigrate the work of Blaise Pascal. I'm sure he'd be as upset with the use of this unit as I am. He was one of the great early mathematical physicists. I would say the only physical scientist yet to make profound contributions to Christian thinking. Many of these are in this little book called The Pensées, loose translation, Thoughts. I read this book when I was a sophomore at MIT, and I thought it was pretty good. It didn't have any impact on my life, but I liked the book. And if I'd been a little more serious about reading this book, I would have recognized that Pascal's theology was centered on the person of Jesus Christ as Savior and based on personal experience. And this is a typical statement from the Pensées. Pascal says that God makes people conscious of their inward wretchedness. This is what the Bible calls sin. And his infinite mercy unites himself to their inmost soul, fills it with humility and joy, with confidence and love, renders them incapable of any other end than himself. Jesus Christ is the end of all and the center to which all tends. Robert Boyle, perhaps the first chemist. You know, I still go back to Berkeley as visiting professor for 2 weeks every summer, and once or twice every summer I'll be walking around the streets of Berkeley down on Telegraph Avenue or somewhere, and someone will come up to me and ask you, didn't you used to be Professor Schaefer? And I answer in the affirmative, and the first question I ask them is, well, did you pass the course? Because they're always talking about freshman chemistry. I used to teach 1,500 freshman chemistry students every year. And they always say yes. I don't think they would ask me if I used to be Professor Schaefer if they had not passed the course. I think they'd probably just spit in my direction or something like that. But then I ask them the big question, which they're not prepared for, is what do you remember from freshman chemistry? Usually we get no response at all. But on a good day, they'll say something like PV equals nRT. Now that shows how many of you are scientists right there. The ones that laughed are all scientists. PV equals nRT is the ideal gas law to which Robert Boyle made important contributions. Boyle was truly a Renaissance man. He was the author of many books, not purely scientific. For example, The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation. He personally endowed an annual lectureship, again, devoted to the defense of Christianity against indifferentism and atheism. He was a good friend of Richard Baxter, one of the 3 great Puritan theologians, and so on. Isaac Newton, any such discussion would be incomplete. Without Newton, there was a poll taken by academics about a decade ago as to who was the most important individual in history. And the winner was Isaac Newton. I think that's a poor choice, but that's what they decided. Anyway, he really was the founder of classical physics and co-discoverer with Leibniz of calculus. He wrote, actually, he spent a lot of time doing chemistry. He was before his time. It didn't work very well. And he spent even more time writing theology. For example, his book, which I actually have a copy of this book, it's still in print, Observations on the Prophecy of Daniel and the Revelation of St. John. This is Isaac Newton's reflections on the return of Jesus Christ. And this next statement is a very famous one. Most physicists would be aware of this. this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Newton was certainly not a deist. He said many other things, for example, the one down at the bottom of the page here. But I really want to get on to another one which has appeared more recently. The truth of the matter is, whether we like this or don't like this, is that Isaac Newton was a biblical literalist. He was a biblical literalist, and for Newton it wasn't enough to say that an article of faith could be deduced from the Scriptures. Here's what Newton said, and here's the source of this. It must be expressed in the very form of sound words in which it was delivered by the apostles. For men are apt to run into partings about deductions. All the old heresies lay in deductions. The true faith was in the biblical text. George Trevelyan, an English social historian, has summarized much of what I've been trying to say for the past few minutes in his book on English social history when he says this: Boyle Newton and the early members of the Royal Society of London were religious men who repudiated the skeptical doctrines of Thomas Hobbes, but they familiarized the minds of their countrymen with the idea of law in the universe and with scientific methods of inquiry to discover truth. It was believed that these methods would never lead to any conclusions inconsistent with biblical history and miraculous religion. Newton lived and died in that faith. Now, my favorite of all these people, and we're going to be leaving dead white males quite soon here, which will be a relief for many, I'm sure. Dead white males not being in good odor these days. But before we leave that collection of people, and I, as usual, I am not getting through this lecture as quickly as I'm supposed to. I do want to say a bit about Michael Faraday. My friend John Thomas, who is now Sir John Thomas. He's become a Sir. This can happen to you, I guess, if you're a good enough scientist in England. The director of the Royal Institution in London for many years. This is not a place for mad persons. The Royal Institution is a distinguished scientific laboratory. He, on the 200th anniversary of Michael Faraday's birth, he wrote a little book on Faraday, which is really wonderful. And in that book, he claims that if Faraday had lived into the Nobel Prize era, lasted about 50 more years, he would have been worthy of 8 different Nobel Prizes. He makes a pretty good case for it. He makes a pretty good case for it. Certainly a remarkable person. I would say the greatest experimental scientist yet to grace this planet. Now, I want to tell you, for comparison with Lev Landau, a little bit about the death of Michael Faraday. Faraday was on his deathbed, and a well-wisher came to him and said, Michael, Sir Michael, what speculations do you have now? This was I don't know how many of you have spent a lot of time around people who are dying. It's not a lot of fun, and this guy was trying to lighten the atmosphere. And it's a good question. I mean, Faraday's whole career was to speculate about something in science, then go into the laboratory and either prove or disprove it. That was his life. And so a reasonable question, Sir Michael, what speculations do you have now? He replied, speculations, man, I have none. I have certainties. I thank God I don't rest my dying head upon speculation, for I know whom I have believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day. The first time I used this quotation was about a dozen years ago. There was a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young man down the front row, and he immediately popped up, well, I've heard that before. I'm delighted to know that Michael Faraday was the first one to say those words. I had to present to this young man the unfortunate news that the Apostle Paul had, in fact, said these words some number of years prior. James Clerk Maxwell, what a guy, I'm telling you. I remember learning Maxwell's equations at MIT. It was tough. It was tough. Every sophomore at MIT had to take electromagnetism, and we were all kind of struggling with Maxwell's equations. And one entrepreneurial young man decided to solve this problem, so he printed up 900 T-shirts with Maxwell's equations on the front and Maxwell's equations on the back. And we appeared at the first examination in electromagnetism with these T-shirts on. And the class average was 97.2%. And the professor was very unhappy with this. So he forbade us to wear these uniforms at the next examination. And the average on the second exam was 17.2%. So we did a lot better with Maxwell's equations on the front and the back. They still make these T-shirts and sell them from the MIT alumni office. So if you're having trouble and if your professor has not learned of these things yet, I would recommend you purchase one such thing. Maxwell possessed all the gifts necessary for revolutionary advances in theoretical physics, a profound grasp of physical reality, great mathematical ability, total absence of preconceived notions. If you've been following me, you know this is not right. Okay? If you've been following me, you know this is a description by some squishy head who doesn't know anything about science. This is some guy that doesn't know anything about science but is trying to earn a living by writing a short essay on James Clerk Maxwell. He had a total absence of preconceived notions. If Maxwell, I mean, this is what Polanyi's whole thing is about. If Maxwell had a total absence of preconceived notions, he would have accomplished a total absence of science. The rest of this is good, though. He possessed the gift to recognize the right task for his genius, the mathematical interpretation of Faraday's concept of the electromagnetic field. Maxwell's successful completion of this task, resulting in the field equations bearing his name, constituted one of the great achievements of the human intellect. This is really true. I mean, Maxwell's equations are awesome. Statement Maxwell made in 1864, "Think what God has determined to do to all those who submit themselves to his righteousness and are willing to receive his gift." He's talking about the gift of eternal life in Jesus Christ. They are to be conformed to the image of his Son, and when that is fulfilled and God sees that they are conformed to the image of Christ, there can be no more condemnation. Now, I have promised to get off the topic of dead white males, and so we're going to skip a lot of wonderful things here. We're going to skip through William Henry Perkin. For my organic chemistry friends, George Stokes. You can see his name in any issue of the Journal of Chemical Physics. Lord Kelvin, J.J. Thomson. He's famous because the electron was just discovered 100 years ago by him. Oh, I can't. One more dead white male. Just one more. Just one more. Just one more, because this one is a quantum chemist, the most lofty of all occupations. Some of you know that this is my occupation, I can see. Charles Coulson, theoretical chemist, one of the three great architects of molecular orbital theory, certainly would have received the Nobel Prize, except he failed in one of the most fundamental requirements, which is to live to be 65 years old. He only lived to be 64, so he didn't get it. This last Nobel Prize, two of these people were 79. I hope they can carry some of that cash into the grave with them. He was the professor of mathematics at Oxford University, Methodist lay minister, spokesman for Christians in academic science. You know, he was, when Coulson died, he was replaced by Norman March, a good friend of mine, who is also a Methodist lay minister. And then when he retired 3 years ago, there was this terrible crisis in Britain. How are they going to find another Methodist lay minister to take over this chair? And they failed, and so just an ordinary evangelical Anglican, Mark Child, had to take the post. Very sad. Anyway, this is from his memoirs describing his conversion to faith in Jesus Christ in 1930 at Cambridge University. Coulson said this: "There were some 10 of us, and together we sought for God, and together we found him. I learned for the first time in my life that God was my friend. God became real to me, utterly real. I knew him and I could talk with him as I'd never imagined it possible before. And these prayers were the most glorious moment of the day. Life had a purpose, and that purpose colored everything. Similar to my own experience, I did not receive any visual or spoken comments from God at the time I became a Christian, but there certainly was a wonderful sense of purpose that overcame me and continues. Okay, so now that's the end of our dead white males. I'm really running short on time here. I'm going to have to skip some of my living white males as well here today, so I'll do that, but there are a couple of them that are good here that I won't skip. John Suppy, member of the National Academy of Sciences, noted professor of physics at Princeton University. I want to use him because his own experience, again, is pretty similar to my own. He began a long and, as he has said, lonely search for God as a Princeton faculty member. And this is his own statement. He says that he was vaguely aware of his spiritual needs. He began attending services at the Princeton Chapel, then reading the Bible and other Christian books. He eventually committed himself to Christ and had his first real experience of Christian fellowship in Taiwan, where he was on a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship. This poor guy had to go all the way to Taiwan to find some Christians. Now, I've given this lecture at the National Taiwan University. I can tell you there are a lot of Christians over there. But there are also a bunch of them in Princeton. He just didn't know them at the start of this, journey. Yes. He says this: if you know scientists and the kinds of problems they have in their lives, pride, selfish ambition, jealousy, that's exactly the kind of thing Jesus talked about and which he came to resolve by his death on the cross. Science is full of people with very strong egos who get into conflicts with each other. And he makes some comments about evolution, which I think are appropriate. He says the gospel is the same for scientists as for anybody. Evolution is basically a red herring. If scientists are looking for meaning in their lives, it won't be in evolution. I've never met a non-Christian scientist who brought up evolution with me. He probably has now. He made this statement 5 or 6 years ago. When you make a statement like that, you're just asking a lot of people to ask you questions. Now, my candidate for Scientist of the Century is Charlie Towns. Now, this is a biased view because among possible candidates for Scientist of the Century, Charlie Towns is the only one I know. So I admit to bias here. But Charlie and I were colleagues for 18 years at Berkeley, and he was a wonderful colleague. At Berkeley, I don't know if you have the same thing at UCSB or not, but at Berkeley, for a prelim examination, these 2 or 3 hour prelim examinations, we would have 4 faculty members from the home department and 1 from another department. And if you're in chemistry, you know, physics is one of the best places to go. And of course, as a result, every time we would go over towards the physics department, these physics professors would have a back door that they would go out of because they knew we were coming to ask them to be on another prelim committee. Charlie wasn't like that. He came over 3 or 4 times every year, and he always paid very close. He was this famous Nobel Prize winner. I mean, he did something pretty significant in 1957, discovered the laser. But he would come over and just be a gentleman and express a lot of interest in the students. Just a remarkable guy. Charlie almost got a second Nobel Prize for interstellar molecules. He discovered the first interstellar molecule on Christmas Eve, 1963, for those of you who are interested in those kinds of things. And this is from his, Charlie has written his biography. It's called Making Waves. That's supposed to be a play on words. Lasers are waves. And Charlie says, you may well ask, this is in the middle of his discussion of his spiritual life as a Christian, says, you may well ask, just where does God come into this? Perhaps my account may give you some answer. I recommend you read it. But to me, that's almost a pointless question. If you believe in God at all, there's no particular where. He's always there, everywhere. He's in all these things. To me, God is personal, yet omnipresent, a great source of strength who has made an enormous difference to me. Another Nobel Prize winner Arthur Schawlow at Stanford University was one of the professors there when I was a graduate student. Nobel Prize in Physics 1981, identifies himself as a Christian and makes this statement. This is in the Lightman book. It says, "We're fortunate to have the Bible, and especially the New Testament, which tells us so much about God in widely accessible human terms." Now, one of the lectures that I give in this series is on the Stephen Hawking phenomena. We're not going to get into that this afternoon, but I do want to point out that the greatest living observational cosmologist, that is a person that actually does the measurements, is Alan Sandage. Alan Sandage, there is not a Nobel Prize for cosmology in itself, but the Swedish Royal Academy every 6th year does give a prize worth $1 million for cosmology, and Alan Sandage got this in 1991. The New York Times calls him the grand old man of cosmology. He became a Christian at the age of 50, which is an interesting story, which he's not that far away. You can drive down to Pasadena and ask him about it. He says, "The nature of God is not to be found within any part of the findings of science. For that, one must turn to the Scriptures." And then he is asked the famous question, can a person be a scientist and also be a Christian? And elsewhere in this interview, he identifies himself as a Christian, but here he says yes. But it's interesting how he defends his answer. Here we have the world's greatest living observational cosmologist, and he's asked if it's possible to be a scientist and a Christian, and he's going to retreat to biology for his answer, which is pretty interesting to me. He says, yes, the world is too complicated in all its parts and interconnections to be due to chance alone. I'm convinced that the existence of life, with all its order in each of its organisms, is simply too well put together. Now, a person who has become a good friend of mine is Donald Page. Donald Page, and Bill Craig knows Donald Page too. Donald Page is one of the most famous collaborators of Stephen Hawking. If you read Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, in the introduction you'll see that Hawking acknowledges him as one of his 3 most influential co-workers. And he's now a professor at the University of Alberta. I met him there last summer. And Don Page says this, "I'm a conservative Christian in the sense of pretty much taking the Bible seriously for what it says. Of course, I know that certain parts are not intended to be read literally, so I'm not precisely a literalist. When the psalmist says that God shelters his children under his wings, it does not mean that God is a big chicken. But I try to believe in the meaning I think it is intended to have." All right, now I am going to finish this talk almost on time. We certainly would not want to leave here without some mention of this year's Nobel Prize winner in physics, William Phillips, for his work on the development of methods to cool and trap atoms with laser light. And at the press conference, in which he was at a conference in Long Beach last October 15th on high-powered telescopes, and this press conference was called because he had just received the Nobel Prize. And it's an interesting, he had some interesting things to say. He said that God has given us an incredibly fascinating world to live in and explore. And in the press release that came along with this, it gave some details on his personal life. It says Phillips is 48 years old, very young. Right, Mike? Very young. Very young. He doesn't even qualify for the seniors golf circuit yet, does he? That's how young he is, yeah. Phillips formed and sings in the gospel choir of Fairhaven United Methodist Church, a multiracial congregation of about 300 people in Gaithersburg, Maryland. He also teaches Sunday school and leads Bible studies. If you read more of this, it's an amazing story. They got every Saturday afternoon, there's an 87-year-old black lady in the congregation who's blind. Every Saturday afternoon, he takes her to the grocery store to buy all her groceries for the week. Really remarkable a remarkable guy. Now, my last slide here is this one. I haven't talked about biology for a very good reason that I'm not a biologist. But I think one can make a pretty good case if one wants to work at it. It may be noted that such well-known scientists as Berkeley biochemist David Cole, who's here and now living in Santa Barbara. David's here this afternoon. And cystic fibrosis pioneer Francis Collins, director of the NIH Human Genome Project, are well known as Christians. So that is most of what I wanted to say. I hope that I have convinced you that not only is it possible to be a scientist and a Christian, but in fact the founders of modern physical science mostly were. And I would challenge each of you in the light of this to consider the claims of Jesus Christ on your own life. Thank you very much.
In his book, God and the Astronomers, astrophysicist Robert Jastrow, a self-proclaimed agnostic, wrote, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." Would you comment on Jastrow's thoughts?
Yeah, that's an interesting quotation, which is now something like 10 years old. And I think what Jastrow was thinking about when he made that statement really was the Big Bang theory. I think this idea that I mean, we would know that certainly before 1965, how the universe began was very much an open question. In 1948, Fred Hoyle and his collaborators made a pretty impressive steady-state theory, which was convincing to a lot of people, and so it's only in more recent years, really, with the Big Bang ripples experiments in 1992, that really have annihilated to the satisfaction of virtually all scientists the idea that the universe has always existed. And so when Jastrow talks about the Word of God, he's talking about, Genesis 1, saying that there was a definite beginning, that God created the universe out of nothing. And so I think he's absolutely right in that respect.
Paul Davies has moved from promoting atheism to conceding that the laws of physics seem themselves to be the product of exceedingly ingenious design. He further testifies, "There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming." Would you comment on Davies' conclusions?
Well, it is impressive evidence. We know that at the rate of expansion of the universe is changed by some very tiny amount, 1 part in 10 to the 15th or something like this, some incredibly small fraction. In either direction, life never would have been possible. So this is a remarkably fine-tuned universe, which from a purely scientific point of view gives us the striking impression that it has to be more than an accident. So yes, I mean, and there are any number of other parameters too. The dipole moment of the water molecule, which is something that we physical chemists know and love. If it's changed by 1%, we're not here. Nothing's here. Nothing living is on planet Earth. So, and there's some 40 or 50 either fundamental constants. You could do the same analysis for the speed of light, the charge on an electron, all of these things, fundamental constants and fundamental quantities in physics and chemistry, any of them change a little bit, make life impossible. So the universe is remarkably fine-tuned. Now, people have attempted to evade this. The most recently is Martin Rees, distinguished cosmologist at Cambridge University, has written a book called Multiverses. And he argues from the anthropic principle, and we're all in agreement on what the facts are, that what this means is there must be an infinity of universes. Now, this is really equivalent to writing a large check on a non-existent bank account. You know, this is, it's strictly an unanswerable question whether there are more universes than the one we're in. So but it does illustrate how desperate people are to explain the universe apart from God. You see, if Martin Rees agrees that this is the only universe, then he's completely at a loss to explain this fine-tuning, which he's the first to admit. So this is his way to evade the obvious conclusion that God has created the universe for a purpose.
Is the oscillating universe model plausible?
You know, I've just been in India for 10 days in last month, and the Indian scientists really like this.
Oh, sure.
Because you know, they'll tell you how it corresponds to the dance of Shiva and all these things in Hinduism. But that is, the truth of the matter is the infinitely oscillating theory, it was certainly Dickey, Robert Dickey at Princeton was one of the proponents of this, but it really died in 1982 or 1983 whenever Alan Guth published this paper in Nature, which really put an end to it. There aren't any cosmologists today who believe in the infinitely oscillating theory of the universe. Now, it is true that every few years people come up with another idea of how to evade God. And sometimes it takes a few years before scientists are able to reject these notions. But they've all been rejected so far, and I expect them all to be rejected in the future. I expect them to go the way of the infinitely oscillating theory of the universe. The infinitely oscillating theory of the universe was a great comfort to people who believed in the steady state hypothesis. That's right. Just about the time the steady state hypothesis died, the infinitely oscillating universe came forward to replace it as you know, the latest non-theistic replacement part. But it's now dead as well, and there's certainly other hypotheses that people make, but they'll all, you know, they're increasingly implausible and not very likely to succeed.
Where did the idea originate that Christianity and science are in conflict?
Oh, that's a good question. A number of people have traced this back a ways, and quite a few of them conclude that T.H. Huxley is one of the authors of all this. Huxley was so-called Darwin's bulldog, and he was a great promoter of Darwinian atheism. And Huxley was, in some respects, a very bitter man. He used to talk about how he hated to go to Cambridge because there were all these Christian theists there. James Clerk Maxwell, J.J. Thomson Stokes, all the distinguished physical scientists in the second half of the 19th century at Cambridge were all committed Christians. And he just hated it there. And he decided he was going to set up an organization that was going to show that God didn't exist on the basis of evolution. And he became very enthusiastic about it. And he has certainly had followers over the years. Andrew Dixon White, the first president of Cornell University, wrote a book about the warfare between science and Christianity. So he was one of the popularizers of this view. Actually, some people will even quote this still. I gave a Templeton lecture at Case Western Reserve University, and a guy stood up at the end of it and said, "What about Andrew Dixon White's famous book on the warfare between science and Christianity?" And I gave him I just happened to have a few examples there misstatements in White's book. White's book is not mentioned by scholars anymore because it's been completely discredited. But there are a lot of people that still read it, even though it's 100 years old. So these ideas, the idea that science had disproved God, really came into public discourse in the second half of the 19th century, and have had some tremendous supporters since then. Richard Dawkins, Carl Sagan. These people are aggressive, in Sagan's case, were aggressive promoters of this idea, but they're really in a small minority among real scientists.
Why did modern science arise in a Christian culture?
Well, I think that the reason it arose, and I would say that science really arose as in the shadow of the Reformation. I think we could be even more specific than that, with this absolute confidence in the truthfulness of God. And John Calvin said, "All truth is God's truth." You know, that was his statement with respect to someone had said to him that he ought to be concerned about some result from modern learning. His statement was, all truth is God's truth. If it's really true, God did it. So I think that that willingness to consider the truth irrespective of any other considerations was a tremendous benefit in getting science going, as it were.
Were Boyle and others motivated heavily by their Christian faith?
Absolutely, absolutely, very heavily motivated by their. Yeah, they wanted to. They were supremely confident that God had created the universe for a purpose, and they wanted to understand how He did it and what His purpose was. So they viewed it as, in a certain sense, as a religious activity.
How is the biblical concept of the fall of man useful for modern science?
Well, I think it is. I think that if we take the fallenness of human beings seriously, we're much more likely to do good science. You know, every day one comes up to an example of where some scientist was so convinced that he had an understanding of a particular phenomenon that he misinterpreted his data in order to satisfy his own hypothesis. This is very, very common. I mean, I've seen it in my work, and we can sometimes become part of our fallenness is that we are partisan. We want our own ideas to prevail. We're sometimes more interested in having our own ideas prevail than to have the truth prevail. And if we're serious about, if we have a serious appreciation of the fall, then we'll know to be cautious about that. We'll know that even the best of our intentions are indeed flawed, and we need to be very, very careful.
Does the intelligent design hypothesis have any scientific value?
Oh, I think the intelligent design hypothesis may be very valuable. My own research in this area is pretty much focused on origin of life questions.
Oh, yes, I'd like to.
And in particular, how one gets from interstellar molecules to the simplest self-replicating biochemical system. So I'm really only, my technical area of expertise is only the very, very first step. You know, how do we get to a molecule that might be called living? As you know, John, this would be something drastically simpler than an amoeba. I think most people think of an amoeba as being something pretty simple. The simplest self-replicating biochemical system would be drastically simple compared to an amoeba. So I'm talking about, in my area of technical expertise, a very, very first step. And to make a long story short, either it never happened or it happened by way of some chemistry that nobody understands as of today. Those are the logic precludes any other answer to that question. Either the first self-replicating system came about supernaturally, or it came about through some chemistry that no one owns today. Certainly the old experiments, the old 1952 experiments by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey have been repudiated by just about everyone now. There's virtually no serious scientist who would claim that those experiments have very much to do with the origin of life.
What are some of the problems with Stanley Miller's origin of life scenario?
Well, one of the characteristics of the Stanley Miller's later work, defending the earlier work, has been to create what I would call a Miller universe. The Miller universe is what is needed to make these simulation experiments of this have some relevance to the origin of life. So he's created a Miller universe in which the ocean has a particular temperature, the atmosphere has a particular constitution, there's a certain amount of oxygen, namely almost none, and so on and so on and so on, to make this scenario of his work. Now, my view is that this is scientifically illegitimate. If one wants to ask a question about how much oxygen was in the Earth's early atmosphere, one should try to concoct some sort of an experiment to tell what that's true. When people actually do that, it turns out there's a whole lot more oxygen. There was a whole lot more oxygen in the Earth's early atmosphere to make these experiments work. But even if we were to, for some reason, which we won't, discover that the Miller universe is right, and it's not. It's wrong in many basic respects. The early universe does not, early Earth's atmosphere, constitution, surface temperature is not what he wants. Even if it were, this chemistry still doesn't work. This chemistry still doesn't work. So virtually everyone who's thought about this has rejected. I mean, even Francis Crick, who was enthusiastic about these things earlier on, and Leslie Orgel, who's probably spent more time doing this chemistry than anybody else in the world, they both have conceded that it didn't happen that way. And so they come up, like Martin Rees, with outrageous ideas, like it flew in from some other
Directed panspermia.
directed panspermia, flew in from somewhere else. And this is, I view this as the last resort of those trying to evade the Creator God.
Despite evidence to the contrary, why do biology textbooks continue to use the Miller-Urey experiments as evidence for a naturalistic origin of life?
Well, I was asked by our local school district to look at some of these high school biology texts. And so I did, and you know, since I had high-level knowledge in this question of the very first step in origin of life, I naturally looked at that, and many of these books have wonderful pictures of this Miller-Urey apparatus. And so I went back and gave my report to the school district. I said that these books were very misleading, that they were not aware. I said even Time magazine from 5 years ago knew that these experiments were not working. So why would these biology texts publish this thing? And they came back to me a while later and said, well, we agree with your analysis, it's correct, but they all have this problem, so we are just going to have to choose one.
What additional information, in your opinion, should be included in biology textbooks?
If they insist on including the Miller-Urey experiments, they need at least to say that they've been discredited and why they've been discredited.
For example?
For example, this chemistry doesn't work. Even in this imaginary hypothetical Miller universe, the chemistry doesn't work. It doesn't produce the right kind of things. It's not leading in a direction towards self-replicating a biochemical system. It's all wrong. When you add on top of that the fact that the Miller universe really was an imaginary universe and the real universe doesn't look very much like it, then the whole concept is shattered. So I would, if they want to include this in a historical sense, and say that in 1970 Time magazine thought this work was as important as Watson and Crick's discovery of the double helix structure of DNA, that's fine for that to be included. I have no objection. They can show the apparatus, but they need to give a substantial discussion of why this model was rejected after that.
For example, cross reactions.
Yeah. Well, you know, we chemists most of these reactions produce what we chemists call tar.
Oh, okay.
Tar is black stuff that sticks at the bottom of the test tube and isn't useful for anything. Most of these reactions produce tar. Basically, so even in the imaginary Miller universe, this chemistry doesn't work, and in the real universe, it most assuredly won't work at all.
Do you believe that the origin of life constitutes a natural discontinuity?
Given all the information we have on the 9th of February, 1998, my position would be that God created the first self-replicating biochemical system. That is not, I'm not making that statement as a matter of dogma. If someone comes along and shows some chemistry that looks more promising than what anybody's discussed thus far, I'm happy to consider it. I'm happy to consider it. But from all we know today, I would say that the most likely hypothesis is that God did it.